Hello, I'm Alan W. Wright, creator of the Robin Hood website, boldoutlaw.com, and I'm back again to talk, of course, about Robin Hood. It's July 1st, 2020. Notice my long lockdown locks. Sorry about that. Well, first things first, I'd like to give birthday greetings, and the birthday girl in question's name is Olivia, and as you might know her better, she's Olivia de Havilland, or Dame Olivia de Havilland, and she's turning 104 years old today. She's still with us. Classic actress from the golden age of Hollywood. You might know her for her Oscar-winning performance in The Heiress, or her supporting role as Melanie in Gone with the Wind. But you're watching a Robin Hood video, so odds are that you do best know her as Maid Marian in the 1938 classic The Adventures of Robin Hood, also starring Errol Flynn as Robin Hood. And if you haven't seen that film, I strongly recommend you go watch it. It is an absolute delight in writing, direction, acting, one of the highlights of Robin Hood cinema ever. And so again, very happy birthday to Olivia de Havilland. If I could bake, I would bake you a cake. And if I baked that cake, I would use Robin Hood brand flour. No, Robin Hood flour is not an advertiser on this video or on my website. I bring it up because they are a Canadian institution. They've been around since 1909, and pretty much those yellow packages are ubiquitous in Canada. Though I know they actually switched to some white ones during the lockdown crisis, but they seem to be back to yellow. And actually, the Robin Hood flower, a proud Canadian tradition, brings me to the second birthday of the video. One that strikes closer to home. My home and native land, to quote the Canadian national anthem. You see, on July 1st, 1867, the terms of the British North America Act of that year, later renamed the Constitution Act, took effect, and some British colonies were merged together to form the Dominion of Canada. Now, this wasn't the proud revolution against despotic tyrants imposing taxation without representation that's part of the American tradition leading to the holiday in a couple of days. No. Canada's Confederation was a more sedate affair, and really, we were like kids going off to college or university, and we'd come back on weekends and have Mother Britain do our laundry for us. We were very much part of the British Empire, and in fact, really, you can say we still are. I mean, Canada's head of state is the unelected Queen of England. No, I'm not going to go there this time. Anyway, so one of the things that kept Canada feeling British were the articles and editorials in the press. One newspaper in particular was the Toronto Telegram. Now, if you're Canadian and you've not heard of the Telegram before, that's not surprising. It ceased publication in 1971, and the Monday after it stopped, the Toronto Sun started up. Now, if you're a Canadian, you're probably familiar with that tabloid paper, and you can correctly guess that its broadsheet predecessor, the Telegram, or the Telly, that's T-E single L-Y as it was often nicknamed, was probably likewise a conservative paper, and you would be right. The Telegram was conservative. It supported the Orange Order. It supported the British Empire in its news and editorials. But that's not all that appeared in the Telegram. Like most newspapers in the 1930s, it had a comic strip section. Now, some of the comic strips were imported from the US. They had Mickey Mouse, they had Buck Rogers. But they also had a couple of Canadian-based strips, including two that were created by writer Edwin Reed McCall, or Ted McCall as he was credited. Ted McCall was a writer for the Telegram, and later on he rose up the ranks to become its managing editor, I think in the 50s and 60s. And so The first strip he did was in 1933. It was called Men of the Mounted. Ted McCall wrote it. The art was by Harry Hall. And it was Canadian successful, Canadian famous. It was reprinted in a little book format, but it didn't break into the American market, except the big American comic book syndicate, King Features Syndicate, seemed to rip it off. Or at least they introduced later a suspiciously similar strip called King of the Mounted, I believe loosely tied in with the novels of maybe Zane Grey, I think, in America. Anyway, this American competition, which I think appeared in rival Canadian publications, spelled the end of Men of the Mounted. And so they stopped that strip in early 1935, and Ted McCall went looking for a replacement comic strip. And so in September of 1935, Ted McCall and Toronto Telegram staff artist Charles Snellgrove launched its replacement, Robin Hood and Company. Robin Hood and Company began on Monday, September 23rd, 1935. It starred with a new character, Sir Graham of Graham, whose name is reminiscent of the legendary Sir Guy of Gisborne, traveling through Sherwood Forest, where he is ambushed in classic style by Robin Hood. And Robin says a line made immortal by Errol Flynn a couple of years later, "Welcome to Sherwood." On the Thursday of that first week, Robin Hood introduces Sir Graham and the reader to his famous band of merry men. And the ones in the strip include Little John, who McCall spells as one word, Robin's right-hand man, and then Will Stutely, one of the many Will S's in the legend, and then finally we have Friar Tuck, who has a veiled threat to Sir Graham. Robin Hood and Company was fairly successful. I know it was published in the Wilson Times of Wilson, North Carolina, and I presume some other American papers as well carried it. I also know that it was republished in various European magazines, so not bad. And it continued on for years, including into May 1938, when this film was on the horizon. I mentioned earlier The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn and our birthday gal, Olivia de Havilland. The Toronto showing for that movie began on May 20th, 1938, and the Toronto Telegram jumped on the publicity wagon for the film, and also garnered publicity for their own comic strip version of Robin Hood. So the Telly launched a contest. Every day, for 2 weeks, the Telly would run a question at the top of the Robin Hood and Company strip, get the answer right, and you could win one of 15 free passes to see The Adventures of Robin Hood at the Uptown Cinema. So, where was Robin Hood hiding? The answers to these questions were also in the classified section. And how many men were in the Merry Men? I don't know, because that varies from story to story. What's Prince John's real name? Well, his nickname was John Lackland, and so I guess that's what they want. And who sacrificed wealth and position for love of Robin Hood? That would be Maid Marian, of course. The question about Maid Marian is ironic in a sense. I've read, I believe, all of Robin Hood and Company as it appeared in the Toronto Telegram, and I don't recall ever seeing Maid Marian at all in the strip. It's not that there weren't prominent women characters. There were. The strip featured long, serialized stories that were often Robin Hood and his men overthrowing a cruel robber baron and putting in the sort of correct landowner in that baron's place. And along the way, there were many women that were lovers, or sometimes even fighters, that were the daughters of the people kicked out, and were very much Maid Marian types, but they weren't Maid Marian herself. Now, Robin Hood and Company carried on successfully for years, but in November 1939, it suffered a tragedy. The artist, Charles Snellgrove, fell gravely ill. He was committed to hospice, and he died a year later. And so Ted McCall's old partner, Harry Hall, who had drawn Men of the Mounted, stepped in as a temporary replacement artist for a few weeks, and then, however, eventually they had to put the strip on hiatus as McCall looked for a more permanent replacement artist. December 16th, 1939 brought a hiatus to the Robin Hood and Company strip with a strip called Robin Will Return. The merry men were up in Scotland fighting off Viking invasions, and Robin had been knocked unconscious and taken away by the Viking raiders. Little John and Friar Tuck said they were returning to Sherwood, but they expected to hear the call of Robin Hood once again. The strip resumed on Monday, February 5th, 1940, with new artist Sid Stein. But the same old predicament. Robin was unconscious and a prisoner of the Vikings. But the Vikings had some troubles of their own in the form of Berber pirates. Eventually, Robin Hood and his newfound allies got away from these seafaring pirate types and made their way to Cyprus, where they overthrew the cruel usurper tyrant and restored the rightful ruler of Cyprus. On the final strip, on August 10th, 1940, Robin Hood vowed to return to England and the merry men, and his new ally, Blackbeard, not the famous one, I assume, vowed to go with Robin because he wanted to meet the famous Little John and Friar Tuck, although we never did get to meet them again because apparently artist Sid Stein went to fight in World War II. If World War II led to the end of Robin Hood and Company as a comic strip, it also led to its resurrection in another form. You see, there were wartime regulations that banned the importation of non-essential items. And among those non-essential items were cheap, simple, mass-market publications, comic books. Superman and Batman were denied entry into Canada. And so, people had to look elsewhere for their heroes. They had to look to Canada. Or back to Mother Britain again. One of the several new startup publishers in the overnight creation of a comic book industry in Canada was Anglo-American Publications in Toronto. And they looked to Ted McCall. And so, on March 1941, the Anglo-American Publications launched what is tied for the first Canadian comic book. And of course, it's Robin Hood. When Anglo-American started their Robin Hood comics, they were tabloid size and just reprinted the newspaper strips. After a while, they changed to traditional comic book size. They were black and white originally as traditional, and they also included the Men of the Mounted strip, rebranded the Scarlet Sentinel, and in time they brought in the American superhero Mr. Scarlet and sidekick Pinky, redrawn for Canada. And then finally, the comic merged with Freelance, another Anglo-American comic by Ted McCall and artist Ed Furness. After Robin Hood's divorce from Freelance, they continued the strip, though using the numbering of the old Freelance comics. And so they continued Robin Hood under its original title, Robin Hood and Company. If you look, you can see very tiny letters there, and Company. What you're going to also have a hard time finding on the covers is Robin Hood himself. Instead, what you're looking at there is Kip Keene, star rookie of the Mounted. Yes, it's Ted McCall's old feature again. But if you look inside, you will find Robin Hood in all of his glory. And so the other thing that you'll notice about these comics is that they are in color, which the earlier comics books weren't. In fact, like the wartime Canadian comic books from several publishers are nicknamed Canadian Whites. partly because they're in black and white, and I assume partly because it's a reference to the infamous Canadian winters. Though, to be honest, I would prefer winter over July heat. Anyway, they did switch to color for the dying months of the comic book industry. You see, the Canadian comic book industry was the result of wartime regulations, and when the war was over, those were lifted. So this is issue 31 from July 1946, issue 32 from September 1946, and Robin Hood Company ended with issue 34 from December 1946 to January 1947, because the import restrictions were over, American comic books came back, and Canadians dropped the Canadian comic books like that. Because, hey, the real deal, the American deal, was back in business. That is so Canadian. Now, before I go on to the other Canadian element of Robin Hood I'm going to talk about, I just want to shout out to two of my sources. First one is John Bell, who published a book, Invaders from the North, that's about the Canadian comic book industry, and he also previously edited a book called Canuck Comics. The other one is an internet source, and that's Ivan Kochmarek from my hometown of Hamilton, Ontario. And Ivan wrote some articles on Robin Hood Company and Ted McCall for the website comicbookdaily.com. So both those sources were immensely helpful. And if you want to know more about Canada's wartime comics, they don't really mention Robin Hood, but there's a great documentary out there called Lost Heroes about the Canadian comic book industry. So the idea of the whole industry coming out because of import regulations with the US and then dying again, as I said, that's very, very Canadian. Canada's culture, Canada's entertainment industry is completely wrapped up with the United States, even today. I mean, the TV show that just finished, Arrow, that's about the comic book character Green Arrow, a superhero version of Robin Hood, essentially, was written in Los Angeles. It was produced in Los Angeles, but was filmed and made in Vancouver, Canada, because it was cheaper. And that doing things in American things in Canada because it was cheaper, that goes back at least to the 1960s, to 1966, with a cartoon that was produced by Steve Krantz in America and was realized by producer Al Guest and his wife, animator Jean Matheson, in Canada. And here's the opening credits for that 1966 cartoon.
Come gather around me, space travelers surround me. Hark now to the ballad of Rockin' Robin Hood. I may well confound you, astound you, spellbound you with heroes and villains, the bad and the good. Watch now as our rockets race here from afar, for now with our Robin we live on a star.
3, 2, 1, blast off! Band of brothers marching together, heads held high in all kinds of weather. With fiery blast our roaring rockets rise, beyond the earth, beyond the skies. At the side of Robin take your stand, with the gallant leader of our band. Send a joyous shout throughout the land for Rockin' Hood.
If you don't know about Rocket Robin Hood, that's not that surprising. It only ran 3 seasons, and in America, that was it. It was off and out of people's memories until its resurrection a couple of decades later as the star champion of the worst cartoons ever made film festivals at Comic-Cons. But in Canada, it had a different fate. They didn't make more episodes, no. But again, Canada had broadcast regulations, and they said that Canadian stations had to show so much Canadian TV every day. And so Canadian stations, being cheap, looked to old reruns to run day in and day out as cultural ballast to make up their Canadian content quotas. And Rocket Robin Hood was excellent cultural ballast. As I said, it was animated in Canada, at least for the first couple of seasons. All the voice work was done in Canada. And so, it became something that I would see on TV multiple times a day. And I was born after the show ended its original run. Now, if you want to know more about Rocket Robin Hood, it was a very cheap show. Most episodes were divided into 3 parts, and each part had its own little mini opening and ending credits. That's animation they could recycle every episode. To further save costs, they also had these little vignettes that talked about the characters that they'd run every episode. And so here's the vignette on Rocket Robin Hood himself.
Rocket Robin Hood, the happy outlaw of outer planetary space, is a direct descendant of Robin Hood of old. He's fast, with a joyful laugh, a ready jest, and a quiver full of futuristic arrows. Robin robs from the cosmic rich to give to the astral poor. He's fun. He's fantastic. Robin Hood, merriest of the merry men, in the astounding year 3000.
The early Rocket Robin Hood episodes really played up his connection to the original Robin Hood. There is an episode where Rocket Robin rescues Maid Marian from being married to the sheriff's cousin, though with a little twist of substituting a gorilla for Maid Marian. And there were various other ones that had Robin Hood-like themes against tax gatherers and such. And of course, they tackled the famous archery contest, but with a sci-fi twist.
Third contest! Archery!
No one can beat Rocket Robin Hood with the arrow.
We shall see. We shall see.
After you, old Ironhead. Rage before beauty.
Get on with it.
Not quite a bullseye, but a hard shot the better.
Turn the target back, please.
No, leave it as it is. The rules say the target must not be altered.
But that's unfair. How can Robin hit a target he can't see?
Silence. You're shot, oh great Rocket Robin Hood.
I did think you'd arrange something more difficult, Your Highness. Ah, well, this is what comes of playing with amateurs.
Will you shoot that blasted arrow?
Of course. I shot an arrow in the sky, and when it hit, they cried,
Bullseye!
The accursed boomerang arrow, I forgot about it.
Perhaps the biggest callback to the original Robin Hood legend happened in the show's second story, The Time Machine, where the wicked Sheriff of Nott, that's N-O-T-T, National Outer Space Terrestrial Territories, I think, sent Rocket Robin and Little John back in time so that the sheriff's own ancestor, the High Sheriff of Nottingham, could deal with them. And so, of course, they met the original Merry Men and went to rescue the original Robin Hood and Little John, who were being held in Nottingham Castle. So here's that first meeting.
I believe I have the honor of meeting the original Robin Hood. And I believe that I am staring into a mirror.
Bless me. It's true. There are 2 of them.
Friar Tuck, who is this great knave? If knave means what I think it does, I'll disintegrate you. One step closer and I'll show thee what it...
Come, we have important work on hand. Indeed, we must get out of here. What shall I call thee, friend? My name is Rocket Robin Hood. Rocket Robin Hood! I like the ring of it.
If you're a geek, you might be interested to know that Rocket Robin Hood was voiced by actor Len Berman, who played Steve Rogers' boss in the two 1970s TV movies about Captain America. And Friar Tuck there is voiced by Paul Kliegman. Now, he also played Will Scarlet in a classic comedy sketch from the Canadian comic team of Wayne and Schuster, Robin Hood's Roast, which you can find on YouTube. Strongly recommended, by the way, more Canadian content. But also, Kliegman's probably best known as the voice of J. Jonah Jameson, Spider-Man's boss, in the classic 1960s cartoon. And that cartoon has a relationship with Rocket Robin Hood. They're both produced by Steve Krantz, and also into the run of both, Krantz replaced the showrunners with animator Ralph Bakshi. And so he came to Toronto, and the show got, well, a little weird.
What is this?
Eventually, Bakshi took the, basically told his bosses in America that Canada was, I don't know, throwing the money away. I'm not sure how, because the show was really cheap to make, but he said that. And he actually fled across the border with the United States, carrying the model sheets in animation hand so they could finish the show in America. Now, the Bakshi episodes were very strange. They had giant. They didn't really have Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham, the Sheriff of Notts, or they had hills that could transform into robotic beetles. They had living shadows. They had the weirdness you saw there, which is from the show's most infamous episode, Dementia 5. Infamous in part because Bakshi reused the animation in almost entirely in an episode of Spider-Man. And so, and by the way, as kids, we did notice that Rocket Robin Hood and Spider-Man fought the same guy. And I remember working out as a child that the Rocket Robin Hood episode had to come first because there was a plot element that made more sense in the Rocket Robin Hood version of the story. So, here's another clip from Dementia 5.
You'll have to fight for it.
Very well. Oh, evil forces of Dementia 5, wrench the prize from the infidel.
It's like everything is alive.
Blast! These things are all around us!
The ring. It's the ring. For that contains the precious library.
Watch it!
It got the ring.
Empty. If he is hiding it upon his person. Fetch Robin and the other one to me at once.
Robin, up ahead.
Run, Little John, run! Don't let them get you!
many years ago, there was a website dedicated to Canadian TV, and I forget the name of the person who created it. I'm sorry. And he said something to the effect of, all opinions on his site were copyrighted him, and you couldn't share those opinions. And one of his opinions were the animators of Rocket Robin Hood were on drugs. I hate to tell him this, but he's attempting to copyright the opinions of pretty much every Canadian child that ever watched that cartoon show. And those bizarre psychedelic episodes, those are the ones that we all remember today. They are the sort of classic Rocket Robin Hood. You think of those weird skies and the strange monsters. But as a child, I preferred what I thought of as the normal episodes. I liked the trickster Robin Hood figure that was fighting corrupt tax gatherers and mocking his enemies. You saw in the clip earlier with the archery contest, Rocket Robin's sense of humor. And that's something I really responded to as a child. Well, anyway, I guess that's it for this video. And I guess I'm going to go and celebrate Canada Day, or Dominion Day as they called it back when I was a very small child. So, happy Canada Day. Happy 4th of July if you're in America. Happy, I don't know what holidays they have in Britain around this time of year, if there's a bank holiday in early July, but if so, happy July bank holiday. And I guess I'm going to take off, eh?